inputs and some of the pathways that we've been describing in class. This, I think, is one thing that I've picked up during office hours is a concern for everybody. So I came up with a couple of practice questions that might be useful. So this one right here basically says, what would happen if you had no pain sensation on the left side of your body? Where could the lesion be? And you have an idea, and so there's given multiple different choices here, and then the other option is you can choose several of them. And so in this case, the last option would be choose multiple ones, and you'd have to pick out which ones were actually the right ones. And so how do you approach a question like this? It's all text, and then you've got several different choices here. The first way that I like to do it is I like to basically set up a diagram. And so I've set up a diagram in a couple of different stages here. First, you can just draw a little guy right here. This is easy to draw on the margin of an exam question or something like that, just so you can kind of get an idea of where things are. The key things you're interested in, spinal cord here, the medulla is right around in here, and then the cortex is up here. And this is just a very simple diagram. Since they're asking about pain sensation on the left side of the body, we're going to draw it on the patient's left over here. And I just drew a star to remind and graphically demonstrate what the pathway looks like. That's a key exam skill that you have, is if you can set up the question as easily as you can, this is a great way to do it. So what we see then is that we have the line going across and then moving up and then ending up at the cortex. Really simple graphic. The only things that I keep track of, you can do it two ways. One is just by simply drawing a line that where it crosses the midline, which is right here, the spinal cord for pain. And that's that anterior spinothalamic tract that we talked about. And then that goes up, and then synapses up here. Second thing that we see is that I demonstrated where the cell bodies were. You don't have to draw that unless you're asked that question. But so you can just draw a little hatch mark. The first cell body is located right here. The second one is right here, and the third one is right there at the thalamus. The thalamus, this is over the spinal cord, and so forth. So it just depends on the nature of the question that you have. If you need to be able to actually indicate those different cell bodies. But just being able to graphically demonstrate where things cross can be really useful. So now that we're looking at this, the question is, where could the lesion be? That would be able to give you numbness over here. Well, it could happen here, anywhere along this pathway here. Conceptually, this is the thing that can help. Think about this as a telephone line that moves up to, from a sender here up to a receiver. And so, in fact, it's a game of telephone, really, from one neuron to the next, where it's being sent and received. Any break along this chain in this telephone line will cause you to not be able to pick up information anymore, so that this part of the brain would not be able to get any information, and you wouldn't sense numbness or pain rather on that side of the from that side of the body. So if you lesion here, for example, the information is just going to get stopped right there, and it'll never reach up to the brain where you can actually be perceived as consciousness. Now this is your right hemisphere, and it's representing the opposite side of your body. But the lesion would happen here on this side of the body, and the deficit, as you experience it, would be on this side of the body. The symptom and the lesion would be on the same side. So just wanted to try to emphasize that. All right, where else could it happen? Well, it could happen here in the spinal cord. And so it could happen on the right spinal cord also and block that. And if it was blocked there, then you wouldn't have pain sensation moving upwards. You could also block it up here in the right brain. And that would prevent the information from getting up here to the right brain, which is responsible for that perception of pain sensation. So these three different pathways are the ones that could be actually affected by or that could be responsible for giving you numbness. Now the other thing that we learned about is primary, secondary, and tertiary, also called first order, second order, and third order neurons that we see here in the sensory pathway. It's always the second order neurons that tend to cross over in the sensory pathways that we've talked about. So that includes the dorsal column pathway and the anterior spinothalamic pathway. And those are the only two sensory pathways that you're responsible for. Okay, so now we've learned a couple of things. We've set up a diagram here. We look to the question and we ask, where's the pain coming from and where's the symptom appearing? And then we want to find out, where's the lesion? Is it on the same side or the opposite side of the body? and is it on the right side or left side? So, and then you're able to kind of track this. There's two other points I want to make here. One is that you have your choices here. You have some that are right dorsal nerve, left dorsal nerve, right ventral nerve, and left ventral nerve. If you remember, dorsal nerve carries sensory information into the spinal cord. The ventral nerve carries motor information out of the spinal cord. And so if you lesioned right here, you would be lesioning, in this case, the left ventral nerve. That would be carrying in the information towards the cerebral cortex. So by having this simple diagram, it can help you be able to map a lot of those different terms and just make sure you've got things kind of organized. So you still need to know the vocab in order to be able to navigate it. You need to know where the ventral and dorsal nerves, what the kind of information they carry. You need to know first order, second order, everything like that. And now this brings me to the second point, which is the term contralateral and ipsilateral. This could have said, instead of saying no pain sensation on the left side of the body, where would the lesion be? And then I could say contralateral brain above the medulla, or ipsilateral brain above the medulla. And what they're getting at here is that they're basically trying to say that there's it's contralateral or ipsilateral to where you see your symptom. So is the lesion itself contralateral or ipsilateral? Ipsilateral means it's on the same side of the midline. So your lesion here, for example, would be on the same side of the midline as your symptom. Whereas over here, it's on the opposite side of the midline, away from the lesion. So that's one example. Let's move on to the next one. Let's do a more complicated version of a pain sensation here, or a sensory issue. And this is using the two pathways that you're responsible for, the dorsal column pathway and the anterior spinothalamic pathway. No pain sensation on the left side, no light touch on the right side. Where is the lesion? So, is it in the right spinal cord, left spinal cord, right brain above the medulla, left brain above the medulla, or are there multiple possibilities to choose from here? To break this down, again, you want to set up a diagram, so I kind of set out the stages here. And then I just threw out no light touch, and so I mapped out that pathway. See how it goes up, and it doesn't decussate or cross over until it gets up to the medulla, and then it crosses over, and then it meets its next neuron, and then projects up to the cortex. So, primary sensory neuron, secondary sensory neuron here, from the medulla to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus up to the cortex. That's the third order or tertiary neuron. Okay, so anywhere along here could be responsible for giving me a situation where I have no light touch on the patient's right side, which is over here. What about no pain sensation on the left side? What could be accounting for that? And then in a separate drawing, I just depicted that. I kept it separate because that keeps it simple, so you don't tend to get confused as easily. If you want to end up combining it, you can, but you may be able to keep things straight better this way. So now what we're looking at is no pain on this side, and then that's a symptom. And then we're saying anywhere along here could give us a problem of picking up and perceiving pain. It's basically what we just worked through in the previous problem. And so if you overlay these two symptoms, so you have to have no light touch on one side and no pain on the other, the only place where these two lines overlap is shown here in the spinal cord. And so that's what I tried to depict in this very simplistic diagram here. So again, set up your diagram, know where things cross, and then that will help you be able to solve these problems. This is an example of the most complicated kind of problem that you could get. Last one, let's go to the motor pathways. Oops, there we go. All right, so here, you lose your ability to generate voluntary motion on the right side. You can still generate reflexes. What kind of a neuron is involved here? And I could have asked which side, left, right, etc. But I wanted to show you how to set this up, and I wanted to emphasize this part: upper, lower, first order, secondary, primary, secondary, tertiary. I could have added more. But you want to be able to ask that kind of neuron. This question gets at a lot of different things and a lot of different types of problems. Let's take a look. Here's our diagram. And then we have the ability, we've lost the ability to generate movement on the patient's right side. So here's our extrafusal muscle fiber. And in this case, unlike the sensory system where it was, information flow was going upwards, instead the telephone game that we're messing up with here is moving from the cortex and moving down to towards the muscle itself. So if we lesion here, or here, or here, we're going to disrupt the connection between the cortex and the muscle itself. So when we look at this, then we want to be able to ask the question of, well, all right, now we can appreciate that all of these things can actually be able to give you a problem in terms of and be responsible for having you lose the ability to generate a voluntary motion. This pathway is known as the corticospinal tract, and we talked about this one in class. This is an upper motor neuron. It originates in the motor cortex and then terminates onto neurons within the spinal cord. This is an example of a lower motor neuron, an alpha motor neuron, for example, that then projects out to innervate extrafusal muscle fibers. The other thing that happens, though, is that, and the reason that we can feel confident about saying that it's an upper motor neuron that might be affected here, is because you can still generate the reflexes. And how does that work? In order to do that, I just wanted to draw a little picture down here illustrating how this could happen. Here's our upper motor neuron again, the corticospinal tract, that then projects down to our alpha motor neuron. Our alpha motor neuron is sitting here, and then it innervates the extrafusal muscle fiber. So just redrawing what we saw above. The thing that I wanted to be able to show to you was that this alpha motor neuron is shared by another kind of neuron. Its sensory neuron comes in, it projects, and it synapses onto an alpha motor neuron. And so now what you have is that this is still intact. The alpha motor neuron is still around. The sensory neuron can carry information, stretch, pain, light touch, whatever it is. And so that information can still come in and synapse onto those motor neurons. So this reflex pathway is still intact. And now we see that a convergence of two different types of pathways. One, the corticospinal tract that we described that's important for voluntary motion. And that uses this lower motor neuron that innervates extrafusal muscle fibers to make your muscle move. And number two, we have our sensory neuron that's coming in and synapsing onto our alpha motor neuron here, and that's responsible for generating movement, but in response to reflexes, so not voluntary movement. And so if you still have your reflexes intact, then that means that it's an upper motor neuron type of disorder that happened here and that your alpha motor neurons are intact. You can also tell that the alpha motor neuron is intact because you'll have some kind of muscle tone still preserved in those in that example. It's not rigidity that happens there. You do have more of a muscle tone, but the kind of rigidity that we're thinking about in terms of rigidity that is described a lot in these types of questions involves our like Parkinson's disease or something like that. So, but you do have more of a muscle tone than you would if you actually lesioned your lower motor neuron. So if you lesion your lower motor neuron, what's going to happen? You're going to end up losing your reflexes, and you're also going to be able to lose your ability to generate a voluntary motion. And you're going to have flaccid paralysis. So two scenarios that are being described here. First one is the one that I said up here, where we still have voluntary motion lost, but we still have reflexes. This is why the reflexes work. It's because we've lesioned the upper motor neurons. The second scenario that I verbally described just a second ago said, what if you cut off your lower motor neuron here? What would happen? You would lose your voluntary motion and ability to generate voluntary reflexes, and you'd also lose your ability to have and generate you lose your ability to generate reflexes as well, involuntary types of motion. So voluntary types of behavior and motor behavior and involuntary would both be lost. And you'd have flaccid paralysis. Hope that helps, and keep me posted if you have questions.